This is the FlowN Morning Show, and it is a review of last night's federal budget handed down by Josh Frydenberg. And joining me in the studio to look at some of the issues that are affecting women is Hannah Phillips from our Flow News 24 team. Hi Hannah, how are you?
I'm going well, Wayne.
Well, this was interesting. I watched last night on Sky News Laura Jays talk about women. This is for you. And she held up a booklet and said we even get our own booklet in the budget with glee. How did you see the separation in the budget of women by the coalition as it handed down its next 12 months of funding?
Look, the Sky News reporter Laura Jays actually did make a really interesting comment there, but I think it is the rebranding exercise coming off of the Brittany Higgins case that has been played out in the media. They're trying to really put this massive focus on women because women may be, I guess, in a way, a political problem, as Sky News actually indicated. But the budget is really quite an interesting one, Wayne. $3.4 billion has been put into this budget. It's a big one. And there's three key areas. There is the women's safety, women's economic security, women's health and well-being are those three key areas it's been broken down into. But is it good news really for women? That is the big question.
Yeah, well, that's one that the Prime Minister, he says that our approach to developing this women's budget has been informed by our values of respect, dignity, choice, equality of opportunity and justice. These are fundamental to the safety and economic security of women in Australia. So we look at this women's economic security and there's $1.7 billion for it. But in the context of this, the $1.9 billion for women's economic security and $1.7 billion for childcare measures, are these for all women?
I would have to say I don't know that they are. This is looking a lot more like a budget of 10 years ago by the Labor Party, when they were all about women having their rights and women having this and women having that. It would seem more and more that the Liberal parties are moving towards a more of a Labor budget. And we did expect that. It was going to be spend, especially going into an election. But the reality is that what we're noting here is that it seems that some women are being left off. What happens to those who choose to stay at home and raise their families? It looks like those women don't seem to be getting any sort of incentive. I'd noticed there wasn't even any income splitting that I could see in the budget there for those families who choose to stay home and raise their children.
That is an interesting point because they say that the new childcare measures, the subsidies, will benefit 250,000 families and that they're good for women re-entering the workforce in order for women to address economic security. This would seem that we're individualising women and not seeing the old family unit, which Joe Hockey in his budgets would have been saying the word for families, and for more families. But this doesn't seem to be the case with this budget. We're seeing very much an individualisation between what's in it for women. And if we, say, take a portfolio in this particular case where women have their own part of the budget, do we continue then to move that the budget then every time has to have a booklet for every particular group, every pressure group? Are we moving towards that, Hannah?
Look, I think we might be. We saw in the Labor papers that they put together at their caucus meeting where they decide what they're going to have their platform be. We saw a very clear indication that Labor are looking at having no genders whatsoever. So I can see in the future we're going to have one for women, one for the transgender group. You know, it goes on and on and on. So where does it actually stop?
Well, there is some positives, I think, for the budget, and that one is that women's safety. The $1.1 billion for women to get out of domestic violence situations. Remembering through COVID-19 that it actually affected women at about 25% higher in increase in domestic violence circumstances. And so this budget does actually take into effect the $12.6 million to expand safe places for emergency accommodation program for women and children, and a further $20 million to be spent to prevent and respond to workplace sexual harassment. These are things that I think everyone agrees with and are positive and having a positive impact for women.
They definitely are. And Josh Frydenberg made a really interesting comment in his budget speech. 1 in 4 women will be a victim of domestic violence or know someone who is in that situation. And money spent in this area is very important. And getting that funding of $5,000, $1,500 cash in hand, and the rest there for your bond and getting yourself set up in a safe environment is really important. But I do want to point out something that Lyle Shelton Britain said, and I read this morning. This one here was on, I guess, where this culture has come from, this toxic masculinity or men behaving badly, where we're noting this is happening more and more, Wayne. And it was made here on Lyle Shelton's webpage. He said Jared Hayne would not be behind bars if he adhered to the code and had not demanded something from a young woman as a sexual assault victim while he waited for a taxi. And he said, what is the link between the porn pandemic with the average age exposure for boys between 8 and 11 and violence against women? Some money for research into that would have been a wise budget investment, but I suspect it's too hot to handle even for a Conservative government headed by a Pentecostal Prime Minister.
Very strong comments, and Lyle Shelton, of course, is a New South Wales politician taking over the position that Fred Nile held in the upper house in New South Wales. These are interesting times. We need to look at the budget in its wider context. I'm sure that there is a positive for women in particular where these violent actions are occurring, but maybe we're actually dealing with the things that are the symptoms we see rather than addressing the causes, and perhaps income splitting for families, the nuclear family that's been the building block for our nation. Taxation benefit for single income families would have been a good measure. We don't see that. What we do see is this idea of everyone being a singular unit, and therefore the singular unit being taxed singularly, and this seems to be where this budget is heading, and from a Conservative government which may not be too conservative anymore.